Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the final day of the First Nation Housing Conference for 2021. My name is Roger Rosa, and I'm the Technical Services Manager for Okanagan Tribal Council out of Thunder Bay. Our next session is the National First Nation Housing and Related Infrastructure Implementation Updates. Our speakers presenting today are Grace Martineau from the Assembly of First Nations. Grace is a senior policy analyst housing at the Assembly of First Nation, working in the housing and homelessness sector of the social branch. Grace is passionate and a strong advocate for advancing self-determination and First Nation housing and works towards closing the gap between First Nation housing and the rest of Canada. Her education and extensive experience working in First Nation housing issues provides the necessary knowledge and understanding to try to improve and fundamentally change government policies and programs serving First Nations in their housing delivery. Grace is a member of Frog Lake First Nation and resides in Nebing, Ontario, just outside of Thunder Bay. Her co-speaker is Dan Gaspé. He is from the Assembly of First Nations. Dan Gaspé is a senior policy advisor for housing with the Assembly of First Nations. Dan is a part of the AFN team that provides housing and homelessness support to the chiefs. Over a 40-year plus career focused on First Nation matters, Dan held management positions with the Assembly of First Nation, was a director of communication with the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, and served as a director of Aboriginal Relations for the Government of Ontario. From 2004 to 2014, Dan split his time between housing advocacy for First Nations of Quebec and as a national director for Aboriginal housing for the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. Dan also worked for several years in the Tarbell Facilitation Network, assisting First Nations and their organizations to create, improve, and implement their strategic plans. Fluently bilingual in English and French, Dan is a member of the First Nation community of Kanesatake. He is also a former elected council member and is proud of his Mohawk heritage.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm happy to be here with you today, speaking to you from my home in Thunder Bay, outside of Thunder Bay, on the traditional territory of Fort William First Nation in the Robinson Superior Treaty area. We're going to hear with Dan Gaspé, who we both will be providing you an update on the First Nations housing and related infrastructure strategy and some of the initiatives linked to that strategy. I will provide you with the presentation. The housing unit at the Assembly of First Nations with the homelessness unit is a newly formed sector within the social branch at the AFN and supports chiefs, technicians, and First Nations in advocating for improved community well-being and equality in housing and related infrastructure, while also working towards closing the gap between the living conditions on reserve as well as on First Nations and the rest of Canada. Over the past year, we've continually heard how COVID has impacted our First Nations, and now COVID has brought to light how serious the First Nations housing crisis really is. There's a momentum in First Nations housing right now, and we are striving to advocate for the much needed investments to meet the housing needs of First Nations. There is a need to fundamentally change how housing is funded and delivered, and ensure that housing needs and aspirations are met, and ensure First Nations can care and control their housing. Go ahead, Dan.
Yes, I'm very honored to be here to present to you. I was at the conference last year in Thunder Bay, and really appreciate the invitation to come and share with you. I'm talking to you from the unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation in the Ottawa Valley near Arnprior, Ontario. And we're here to talk to you about the strategy, the National First Nations Housing and Related Infrastructure Strategy. A little bit of background that the chiefs had asked back in 2017 to have the First Nations, have the Assembly of First Nations work with the federal government to develop our own national strategy. And so we've formed a joint working group with membership from the regional First Nations housing technicians, Indigenous Services Canada, Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, and Employment and Social Development Canada. And we've been working since then on a number of key milestone documents, starting with a policy reform framework and then a strategy, which was adopted by the chiefs by resolution in 2018. Since then, we've been working on other milestone documents towards a memorandum to cabinet to fundamentally change the federal government's First Nations housing policy. The strategy itself is divided into four main themes: governance and delivery, funding and finance, skills and capacity, and First Nations information sessions. The work last year, interrupted somewhat by the COVID-19 pandemic, but continued nonetheless, was to focus on developing an implementation plan. The implementation plan was completed in late 2020. It aligns all the initiatives and objectives and goals from the strategy to short, medium, and long-term outcomes and a set of performance measures. The strategy and its implementation plan are used both as a guide for First Nations to develop their own plans and performance measures. And it's also used as a guide to when we draft the memorandum to cabinet to change the policy, as I mentioned earlier. It's important to note as well that the chiefs, when giving the mandate to develop this national strategy, indicated that it's important that First Nations citizens, wherever they live, be served by their First Nation. So the strategy includes First Nations living away from their community, many of them in urban centers. What we've been focusing on more recently is a more detailed operational plan, which ensures that the momentum keeps going on building, on implementing the strategy. And the key item in the operational plan for this year is the development of the memorandum to cabinet. Now, I have to put a little caveat on that, is that that is controlled by the federal government. They have committed to us in the past that that was the ultimate goal, to get that their First Nations housing policy changed through a memorandum to cabinet. But we haven't, the drafting of that hasn't started yet. We're hoping that it would start in the middle of 2021, somewhere around September. And we've made a lot of progress. We've got the input has come from 4 national housing and related infrastructure forums held over the years. The last one in Toronto, many of you probably participated. And on the second last or last day of that forum was when the World Health Organization declared the worldwide pandemic. And so in a way, we were lucky to get that forum in just under the wire. And of course, everybody's lives have changed since then. And yeah, I'll pass it over now to Grace, who'll talk a little bit about the costing of the strategy and the very important funding and full full funding of the strategy.
Thanks, Dan. But in order for us to effectively approach the government and advocate for the investments needed to meet First Nations housing needs, we must first obtain the cost estimates on what those needs are, and determine the investments required to address the gap in housing and related infrastructure. We're going to be embarking on a cost estimate study, which will be based on the past data that we have gathered. So the data related to the housing that was recently completed last year or the year before throughout Canada within the regions. So cost estimates will be based on this data, and will include the physical needs such as houses, dwellings, and anything related to the livability of the house. But it's not going to include the central sources of infrastructure such as central water plants or water mains. Costs will also capture not only current need, but also a forecasted future needs for housing, and will consider demographic trends such as mobility on and off the First Nation, looking towards 2030 and 2040. So we expect this work to be completed by the fall and presented to the Chiefs Committee on Housing and Infrastructure. And it's this information that we will use to build our case and propose to the government the investments that First Nations really need. Another goal within the strategy is to establish a First Nations Housing Policy and Research Center. So this goal was identified by through the engagements that Dan had referred to, such as forums and other means. It's proposed to be it's supposed to function as a resource center for First Nations on housing research, information, tools, best practices, and innovation, and much more. We're completing a feasibility analysis right now, and it will determine whether or not this is a good idea. We're working with a consultant who is completing this work, and we've also recently completed engagements with First Nations housing representatives across Canada. So this report has been completed, the work has been completed, and we're just reviewing the report. And that will be presented to the Chiefs Committee on Housing and Infrastructure. So the next steps on this will be to complete a business model and business plan, and then we'll continue to engage with First Nations across Canada on this development.
Thanks, Grace. I think at this point, I'd like to just give a sense to the participants of some of the other items that the Assembly of First Nations Housing Unit is responsible for. I just want to make a special note about the Dene Nation in the north. We have a resolution to provide some special assistance to the Dene Nation because they're in a very unique situation, and their housing is support services are provided by the government of the Northwest Territories. It's very different from First Nations south of 60, where we work with Indigenous Services Canada and the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, and the Dene Nation is very interested, just like the First Nations in the South, to get greater control of their own housing, but it's going to take a unique and special effort to do so. And I think with our help, the Dene Nation is making some inroads in that regard. So I want to also add that we are doing some work to better understand housing for First Nations citizens who live away from their communities in urban centers. So we want to do more of an environmental scan and a systems map to help First Nations understand what kind of assistance is out there right now. And it'll be up to each First Nations to decide what relationship they want with the Indigenous housing providers that exist in most Canadian cities. We are also going to be communicating the strategy and all the work that we're doing a lot more this year with a development of a communication strategy. We realize that we have can do a much better job of getting the information out, so people are much more aware of the strategy. One important feature that we didn't mention yet was that we, for the first time in 2019 and completed in 2020, there was the AFN oversaw the collection of First Nations housing data through a national First Nations housing survey. We have a report on that gives us the results, and we are still analyzing it, and the consultants that are going to be doing the cost estimates will be using that as one of the key documents to on which to base the costing estimates for implementing the strategy. This year we're going to be looking at what went well and what could have gone better in that process of gathering that data, and so that we're ready with an improved process to do a second round of data collection through a national housing survey in 2022-23. We're also going to be doing a national assessment of the capacity and skills needed in First Nations to control your own housing. And we're also advocating to Indigenous Services Canada and Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation that because of the COVID-19 pandemic, the housing crisis that already existed in many First Nations was exacerbated, and chiefs are really pushing for additional housing support funds immediately, not to wait down the road. And we're getting hints from the federal government officials that there may be something on First Nations housing announced in the April 19th federal budget. So we're anxiously awaiting for that. And we're also been asked by the chiefs to work with Indigenous Services Canada and Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation to improve their information sharing with us, because if we're going to work we are working well together and closely, but there are some information that they share with us a little bit late, and it could be a little more timely. And there are some things that they've done that we feel they could have worked with us from the beginning. And that brings me to the Rapid Housing Initiative, which was an initiative Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, part of the National Housing Strategy, which is the mainstream Canadian housing strategy, announced in 2017. The Rapid Housing Initiative was announced in the fall, and it was designed to address homelessness, and the government acknowledging that First Nations are overrepresented in the homeless population, said that they direct most of the funding, or a large share of the funding, to projects that would help house and provide quick housing through modular units to the First Nations. And so that process is going on right now. Some of them have been announced, some of them have not been announced yet. And there are hints that maybe there'll be a second phase of the Rapid Housing Initiative coming out of the April 19th federal budget, but we'll wait and see. And so those are some of the key initiatives that we've been working on, that we continue to work on, and we've got there's a lot of work, and we are really appreciative of all the input and guidance we get from our regional housing technicians, each region represented on a joint working group, and as well on a national committee of First Nations housing technicians. So that wraps up our presentation, and I think we wanted to go to a poll of participants that would just help us get a bit of information on what participants know a little bit about the strategy and the Rapid Housing Initiative. So what we're asking, what we see here is that we have close to half of the, if we add B, C, and D together, columns B, C, and D, we get a sense that there's some awareness, and there could be a lot more awareness. So this really underscores the need for a lot more communications. And that's why we are going to be focusing a lot more on communications in the coming year to explain what the strategy is about, what the commitments are from the federal government, and how First Nations control of your housing is in your best interest, on condition that the federal government follows through with its commitments.
Mm-hmm.
The second question is really to find out whether or not you're aware that Indigenous Services Canada has already started an initiative to discuss on a regional basis with First Nations that have said they're willing to start those discussions on the transfer of housing services to First Nations control, which would entail the development of First Nations housing authorities on whatever basis the First Nations wish. Some of them on a provincial regional basis, others on a provincial territorial organization basis. Those discussions have started in British Columbia and Saskatchewan, Quebec, and interest has been shown in the other regions to start those discussions as well. The poll here suggests to me that over half of you are at least somewhat aware, but there's still a significant portion of you that are only somewhat aware. So it tells me that, again, we can do a better job of communications, and that's what we plan to do.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this last poll question was more about the Rapid Housing Initiative, and to give us a sense of when we go to advocate to the federal government about the second round of Rapid Housing Initiative or anything similar to it, we want to know what people know about this strategy, especially if its terms were acceptable, because some First Nations said it was too complex and too quick to even submit a proposal on time by December 31st, 2020, when it was announced in, I believe it was late October. It gave about 2 months to prepare a decent proposal, and some First Nations found that very stressful and difficult. So what we're seeing here is that a range of responses, most folks being somewhat aware of it, at least, and this information will help us to press the government to do more to to work with us to develop the terms of the next phase so that it fits with the reality of the First Nations, and that they will face less criticism and there'll be more uptake by the First Nations that really need it. Thank you.
Mhm.
We're available for questions.
Okay, Dan and Grace, there's a question from the audience here. It's, are the rising costs of material being surveyed and incorporated into the study? If so, is it short-term or long-term, and how will it impact First Nation housing?
You want me to take a stab at that, Grace?
Sure.
Well, for sure, we've heard that there have been tremendous increases in cost of materials, which is, of course, contributing to the high cost of housing, making it even more difficult. And for sure, we are going to take that into consideration. We have no idea if it's going to be a short-term phenomenon or if this is going to be more permanent. But the consultants that we are contracting are some of the best in Canada and have done a lot of experience and have worked with the AFN before in other sectors. And so the whole idea of how this will impact First Nations is that going forward, the federal government will have a lot better data than they've ever had before on which to base their policies, but also their budget decisions. Many chiefs have expressed concern that they don't trust the federal government will really follow through on its commitment to once and for all properly fund and sufficiently fund First Nations housing, because the estimates to date have been in the neighborhood nationally of at least $30 billion over the next 10 years. And it's likely more than that now that we've seen the COVID-19 and cost increases on materials. So I guess how it will impact First Nations is that the programs should be better funded in the future. And if negotiations go well and the federal government follows through on its commitments, within the coming years, many more First Nations will be controlling their own housing programs, developing their own and the housing programs, and the federal government will just be the funder. And with that control, First Nations will be able to design their own programs and have the confidence to do multi-year planning rather than to struggle along as they are right now on annual funding that is insufficient.
Thank you. There's another question's been submitted. Do you know of any steps being taken to make sure that the design of the housing units being provided through the Rapid Housing Initiative will be appropriate for the climate and interior conditions experienced in the participating communities?
Well, the Rapid Housing Initiative, as I mentioned, was the responsibility for it was handed to the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. They didn't consult the AFN. I don't know if they consulted any other First Nations. We haven't heard of any. So one of its major features was in order to make it rapid, that is to get these houses in by sometime in 2021, that they be modular units. The National Office of CMHC told us that they would exercise great flexibility with those First Nations who wanted to build in the traditional stick-built construction. However, we hear that was perhaps not applied evenly across the country, and that especially northern communities were complaining that it doesn't make sense to ship modular units when it's more cost efficient to build in the traditional way and shipping materials. So as far as the design to be appropriate to climate and so on, it's we were not consulted on that, but it certainly makes sense. And if we have an opportunity to influence the second round, if there is a second round of the Rapid Housing Initiative, we're going to consult widely with our regional technicians who are going to provide us the input that is appropriate to each region on, so that hopefully they will be a lot more appropriate to various climates across the country.
Thank you. There's another question here. How will First Nations control of housing lead to better housing for First Nation members?
Well, you know, it's like I mentioned in my presentation just a little bit on that, if one controls the development of programs, then you'll have programs that fit the particular circumstances of the community, and you'll be able to plan over many years. And so by having that control, you're not dealing with programs that have been developed by somebody else somewhere else and then forced on you and given you as the only option. So it's an example of Section 95 CMHC. Many First Nations have used Section 95 and continue to do so because there are very few options. And it's very complex. And we get reports of a lot of lack of flexibility of its application. And they're just, it also puts a heavy debt burden on First Nations, despite the fact that the loans provided are low interest loans. There's a lot of concerns there. So with control by First Nations, whoever manages these is accountable to the First Nations. The First Nations people will hold these new entities accountable to them. And the federal government just becomes a funder. And so there's a long way to go. But those, like I said before, those discussions have started in many of the regions, and none have concluded yet. The issue of funding, sufficient funding, is going to be a very interesting challenge to get over.
Thank you. How will First Nations control of housing help the many First Nation citizens that live away from the home communities?
Well, you know that many First Nations people live away from the community, not by choice, but by circumstance. That is, that there's not enough housing on many First Nations, most First Nations. And the data that I've seen shows that a lot of those people live within the vicinity of their home First Nation. Yes, many do live in urban centers for jobs and for education, and that are far away from their home reserve. But when chiefs and advisors are asked to design a better system, they want to include their citizens wherever they live. You know that the courts have decided years ago that First Nation citizens have a right to vote in their First Nations elections wherever the people live. And so they expect, those people do expect services from their chiefs and from the institutions that are set up for them. So the chiefs want to have the sufficient money to attract their people to return to the community by building good housing and sufficient housing. And and for those people who are living further away, they want to be able to attract them home in their retirement years or after they've finished their education. So yeah, the chiefs are looking further down the road and have a vision of comprehensive services for all their people, no matter where they live in Canada.
Thank you, Dan. And one final question here. Why should First Nations trust the federal government will properly fund housing so that the First Nations are not stuck managing a broken and underfunded system?
Yeah, it's an important question because a lot of chiefs, even though they've passed resolutions saying we want control, they're still distrustful because of what's happened in the past. You had a devolution process back in the late 80s and early 90s where a lot of the terms were dictated by the federal government. The funding was limited and so on. And so, you know, trust is an important factor, and it's on the onus. The onus is on the federal government to build that trust with the First Nations. And it's going to take time to do that, but all we can do in the meantime is keep advocating and pushing based on facts. Here's what the needs are. Here's what it's going to cost. First Nations need multi-year commitments and funding so they can plan ahead. You know, it's our job at the FN to advocate and keep pushing on the government on its obligations, whether they be fiduciary obligations or treaty obligations to in relation to housing. And you know, it's really up to the federal government to show First Nations that they're going to put sufficient funding in. My advice to any of the First Nations that are currently in discussions with Canada on transfer of control is to really do a good analysis as to whether the funding is sufficient that they're committing, and so that they're, you know, you address the backlog that exists now, the future needs, the mold that's in many communities, and all the issues that there's so many other issues in housing. So you know, if they don't come through with you know, especially that sufficient funding commitment, you know, my advice would be don't sign any agreement to accept transfer of control, because you'll be managing your own poverty and you'll be managing a broken system. So a lot of them know that, and they've told us that. And so it's really the onus is on the federal government in terms of funding commitments. But the work that we're doing with Canada is going in a positive direction. It's led by the First Nations. Even though it's joint work, we do all the drafting, we do the scheduling, we set up the events, and so on. So I'm optimistic for the future, but also very carefully watching the federal government for its commitments.
Thank you, Dan. On behalf of the First Nations Housing Conference, we'd like to thank you and Grace for presenting today. And you'll be receiving a commission print from First Nation artist Daryl Big George that will be sent to you. And
Thank you.
The tech will be putting that up on the screen.
Thank you. Hi.
And I'd like to remind the audience to write down the code to have a chance to win a Roomba vacuum, AirPods, gift cards, and much more. I would also like to ask everyone to complete the quick session survey at the bottom of the page. And there'll be a quick break, and the next agenda will be starting at 2 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time.